Und die erste Möglichkeit gibt es direkt jetzt, zum Beispiel diesen Face-to-Face-Button zu nutzen, nämlich in unserem Eröffnungspanel zum Thema Compounding Disaster Risks in a Changed Climate, Will the Humanitarian Development Nexus Hold Up? And for this, I'm switching to English and handing things over to Maarten van Aalst, Director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Good morning, Maarten.
Good morning, how are you?
Very good.
So thank you very much for handing over for this exciting opening panel that we have here. We will be joined by an amazing panel, but also looking forward to a discussion with all of you. So a very warm good morning to all distinguished panelists and participants who have joined us virtually. It's great to welcome you to the German Disaster Risk Reduction Conference, and especially this first event on compounding disaster risks in a changed climate. Will the humanitarian development nexus hold up? And I think we've all seen around the world how humanitarian work is already being challenged by disasters that have changed today. Interestingly, not just in the humanitarian contexts where many of us are working and where the hits of the changing climate are hardest, but also in developed countries where, for instance, Canadian Red Cross was responding to the record heat wave last summer that hit meteorological records before that meteorological measurement station was burned down by a forest fire. We now know that that event would not have happened without climate change. And of course, we're in Germany right now. The terrible floods that killed so many people in the heart of Europe were up to 9 times more likely due to climate change. Now, these calculations are easier to do in richer countries where the data is better and where the models are easier to run for these types of events. But we know this is happening around the world. And we're now gearing up to the climate conference in Glasgow, where the world is coming to grips with how to keep this problem from getting further out of hand, but also how to manage the challenges that we already face today. So it's wonderful to be here with you and confront those big challenges. My name is Maarten van Aalst. I'm director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. I'm also a professor of climate and disaster resilience at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, and a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and particularly Working Group 2, which is dealing with impacts and adaptation, and will be launching its big next report in February, and some sobering messages coming up there as well. My role today is to moderate this side event co-organized by the government of Germany, the German Red Cross, and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And in this event, we will examine the impact of compounded and increasing risks on the most vulnerable people. And that compounding nature is, of course, something that we've witnessed in many cases as well. And actually, we're witnessing, for instance, we were speaking of rich countries. I was just watching CNN yesterday and saw that in the west of the United States, they're now worried about heavy rainfall hitting areas that were prior burned down by the wildfires, increasing the risk of devastation there from the wildfires first and then the flooding now. And we've seen so many cases, for instance, in East Africa, first hit by flooding in that first phase of COVID and now facing droughts. It's often the resilience degraded over cycles of consecutive disasters, but even different hazards colluding. Secondly, we'll be presenting the challenges on how to link climate and disaster risk reduction across the humanitarian and development spectrum. And we know development and humanitarian organizations may sometimes work separately and have their own mandates. But the challenges that they're facing are joint ones. And how do we weave that perspective of addressing the risks of high impact, but relatively low frequency? I'm saying relatively because actually it's not so infrequent at the moment, events, into how we do development in these most complicated contexts. Is the disaster risk reduction imperative from the Sendai framework being challenged in the changing climate, or is actually all the attention for climate an opportunity to get higher on the political agenda and indeed weave these agendas together more strongly? How can we propose next steps to ensure we are building forward better and strengthening our systems to be better fit for the future as we are hit by all these disasters? Can we scale up anticipatory action to be better at anticipating at the shorter term and using that information also to address longer term risks? So not small questions, but I'm delighted to be discussing them here with this fantastic panel and with all of you at this conference. That is exactly what your conference today is about. Now, before we officially begin, a couple of housekeeping measures to take care of. So first of all, we have closed captioning, so you should be able to see that. The event is being recorded, so if you are uncomfortable with that, please keep your video off. Please stay on mute if you're not speaking. And finally, you are welcome to post your questions and comments in the chat of the conference video. So you can already reflect on what is being said in the panel, but in particular, you can pose your questions to the panelists for the conversation later. We will have a Q&A, but you can already pose your questions in the chat and they will be put together for our discussion later in this panel. Now, without further ado, let me also introduce our panelists. And it's an honor and a privilege to be joined today here by, first of all, Ms. Mami Mizutori, the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Disaster Risk Reduction and the head of UNDRR. Mami, a very warm welcome to you. Secondly, we have Ms. Bärbel Kofler, the Federal Government Commissioner for Human Rights Policy and Humanitarian Assistance of the Government of Germany. And again, Germany has been a leading actor in joining these agendas, and in particular also in this agenda of anticipatory action, where so much has shifted in the humanitarian world in the last 10 years, also enabling some of these bridges to the climate agenda and to the longer term development agenda. So we owe the German government already the changes that have moved so far. And I think it's wonderful to have you on this panel, Ms. Kofler, to discuss what is next in these overlapping agendas. And thirdly, but not least, Dyce Nkhoma, the Director of Disaster Risk Reduction of the Risk Reduction Department of Disaster Management in Malawi. Now, Malawi, one of those countries already hit by the shifting risks, confronted by the changing climate, but also in many ways leading the way, addressing these challenges already in practice on the ground. So we're delighted to be able to hear from you. And just by way of setting the scene, we are in an even more complex world now than where we were 2 years ago. It's clear around us, as I was already saying, that the climate is changing, but of course we're also coming out of an unprecedented humanitarian crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's added to the challenges of responding to disasters over the past years, more complicated evacuations when we had to also look after social distancing or have protective materials available, but also compounding challenges, for instance, food security challenges when food markets were also being disturbed, or more challenges picking lives back up after being hit by an extreme event when livelihoods were also affected by the economic downturn due to COVID-19. The World Bank estimates that over 100 million people have been thrown into extreme poverty due to the impacts of the pandemic so far. And we're basically set back after several decades of improvements in the rates of extreme poverty by that massive amount of people. On the one hand, making it harder to achieve our SDGs, which was already challenged by the changing climate and the consecutive disasters we're facing, but also making people even more vulnerable to those extremes that they're facing in that changing climate and due to those natural hazards that are leading to disasters, unfortunately. So our challenges have just grown with more people, especially also in those humanitarian contexts, even more vulnerable and less resilient to the shocks that we're facing. Second connotation to that is that, unfortunately, we've seen that inequalities have risen. We're not only seeing more people thrown back in extreme poverty, but we're also seeing inequalities in how currently the pandemic is being addressed around the world, with countries like my own, the Netherlands or Germany, already quite fortunate to have large numbers of the population vaccinated, but that not being the case in many of the countries that are also hit hardest by the changing climate. And we're confronted with that also as people head to the COP in Glasgow next week. I heard 1/3 of the leaders from the Pacific Island countries, for instance, is unable to make it to Glasgow because the quarantine rules that they would have to face along the way, even getting to the United Kingdom, would be too disturbing. So we're seeing several global challenges intermingled in terms of the realities on the ground dealing with the disasters, but even the diplomatic realities of how we now come to solutions. So once again, we have 3 leaders here around the table, and I'm delighted to hear their questions on their answers on how we confront this challenge. Let me start with Mami Mizutori of UNDRR. Can you tell us a bit about the role of anticipation, seeing disasters coming with better weather forecasts, to be able to improve humanitarian work, to improve the way we cope with those disasters when they come, but also how that sort of work can provide a bridge to longer-term risk management, including adaptation and development planning?
Thank you, Maarten, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I'm delighted to share this panel with Ms. Kofler and dear friend from Malawi, Mr. Nkhoma. So, anticipatory action is becoming more and more important, and more now, I would say, in the humanitarian work. And this is about taking action before disasters strike, so that we can reduce the impact of the terrible events as much as possible. We now have, as you have been telling us, Maarten, very eloquently, more frequent and intense hazard events due to climate change. And at the same time, we have better early warning systems than before. And we know that by using them, we can take earlier action to save lives and livelihoods. We can get ahead of the curve and have resources available for the most vulnerable people to minimize the need for humanitarian action. There are many emerging tools, mixing predictive modeling with real-time data that are helping us anticipate and act. But we still need to improve, I think, the quality and the quantity of data so that funding and resources can be reached in the most timely way to the most people in need. And importantly, we need to enhance the political will to anticipate and act, not go back into the traditional way of waiting until the disaster strikes. And this needs a lot of political will. But I think we're getting much better at this now. At UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we are now working with countries like Bangladesh and Fiji to help them improve their data and analytics on the hazards they are facing, their vulnerability, and their capacities, so that anticipatory action can be carried out better by the governments themselves and also by all humanitarian actors. But as you mentioned, Maarten, humanitarian action, it has to be embedded with risk and it has to be anticipatory, but we should not stop there, because if we can't really embed risk in everything we do, not only humanitarian action, but importantly in everything we do connected to development in the long run, then we're not preventing better, and the development gains that you were talking about will always be eroded. So there is a very important role of anticipation for adaptation and development planning. And this is about how to comprehensively assess and manage climate and disaster risks in the long term. This is very important in the long term, so that development is sustainable and gains are not eroded by disasters. And this is about being smarter, planning ahead, understanding our options, and prioritizing development agenda actions based on the data we have on both the past events and the future probabilities. It's not enough to know what happened in the past. That's important, the loss and damage, where did they come from? But we also need to put into our planning the future risks in order to anticipate better. Now, you were mentioning about the grim reports that are coming out. The most latest Working Group 1 report of IPCC establishes that global warming may increase by 1.5 degrees by the early 2030s, much earlier than predicted previously. This means that the warmer climate will result in increased heat waves, longer warm seasons, shorter cold seasons, and countries will experience more intense floods and droughts. And the extreme events may be at an unprecedented scale when they occur with larger magnitude, increased frequency in new locations with different timing and new combinations. So we definitely need to urgently accelerate both our disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation actions through tracking implementation of the Sendai framework and the Paris Agreement. They need to go ahead hand in hand. And the actions that we need to take is first to ensure that DRR strategies take into account the climate future and at the same time ensure that national adaptation strategies are based on a solid understanding of disaster risk. The synergy has to be maintained. Again, we need to locate risk management at the core of all development and humanitarian interventions throughout the whole process. Third, we need to acknowledge the complex and systemic nature of risk in the context of climate change, and then cover the full spectrum of climate-related hazards, extreme events, slow onset processes and trends, as well as their interactions with and impacts on non-climate hazards. And we definitely need to enhance the capacity of governments to plan for sustainable development in a complex climate future. Now, over the next 2 years, we, UNDRR, will aim to help improve disaster and climate data access and quality in more than 50 countries. And we will work with national experts and governments to make sure that they are better equipped to manage their climate risk. As I already mentioned, we are all in this together. You said that, Maarten, COVID and climate emergency. We are all in this together. Last year, while 10 million people were displaced by conflicts, already terrible, a record 30 million were displaced by climate-related disasters. So if we do not act more decisively, I do not see this situation contained. Back to you.
Thank you so much for laying out the imperative for the sort of work that we are now all confronted with, but you've been leading the world on. You were calling very eloquently for that blending of Sendai and Paris. I think we're somewhat preaching to the converted maybe in this disaster risk reduction meeting, but the world needs to hear that. And we thank you for your sharing of that word everywhere. We know you play a very important role in the international system doing so. Calling, as you said, for attention for the most vulnerable, the need to base this all on data, to generate political will, because that's what it requires. Also to look beyond the current electoral cycle to address these challenges, which are clearly changing and getting more challenging. I also noted your call to address more this complexity and the compound nature of these risks, and how the climate risks are not standing on their own, but they're combining with other factors and often also driving other types of risks that are not directly climate related. So it's all intertwined. And thank you again for your leadership, but also sharing these thoughts with us. With that, let me come to our next panelist, and we'll come back to you, Mami. Thank you for staying with us. Ms. Kofler, the Federal Government Commissioner for Human Rights Policy and Humanitarian Assistance. Now, you have, as I said, played a key role helping the humanitarian system adapt. To some extent, I think that humanitarian system is also starting to seep into some of these other discussions. We're seeing that humanitarian voice more strongly now, for instance, in Glasgow in the climate discussions. And we can, I think, to some extent see either the failures or the successes of the humanitarian system we can use them as a way to take stock of whether we're succeeding in effectively addressing the climate crisis. Now, can you tell us how you see that adaptation of the humanitarian system evolving and what is needed to be informed about the future impacts we have to deal with? And how do you see, the same question as I was asking Mami, the role of anticipation for humanitarian work, also for bridging to longer term risk management?
Well, thank you very much, Maarten. And also from my side, a very warm welcome from Berlin. And it's good to see you, Mami Mizutori, again, even if it's only virtual. Pleasure to see you, pleasure to get to know my colleague Nkhoma from Malawi. So nice to be on that panel. And it's a good sign that we have such an engaged community on anticipation and disaster risk reduction worldwide. And starting with your last question, Maarten, I think anticipation is key in humanitarian action and is key if we want to interlink climate change and humanitarian action and humanitarian assistance. You know, you mentioned in the beginning what happened this summer in Germany. I know, of course, in a lot of other European countries, but worldwide, it's always the same issue. Suddenly, in areas where you didn't expect it before, due to heavy extreme weather conditions, due to climate change, suddenly terrible catastrophes are happening. And well, I'm not coming from the R or from North Rhine-Westphalia, but in my constituency, I've seen it myself. I'm coming from the south, and I've seen what it makes to people and houses when the mountains are coming down and the whole mud and water is going through the houses and destroying existences of people and even costing life. And that's what we are talking about. I've seen it in my country. I've seen it. I've personally visited those people in my constituencies, and it's a lot of pain, fear, and it has to do with the loss of dignity also from the people who are suffering from those crises. And anything we can do to prevent those events for the people, for the benefit of those who would suffer under those crises, man-made, climate change, extreme weather catastrophes, everything we can do on that is very important. And that's why I think anticipation is important. We have to talk in Glasgow. Of course, there are a lot of things to debate on mitigation and how we can reduce carbon dioxide and other gases and what we can do to stop climate change. But it is important to talk about adaptation, and anticipatory humanitarian action is part of that and is a very crucial and important part. So what we have to do, in my opinion, is of course reducing this vulnerability of people, and that therefore we have to strengthen capacities in the whole system, but also in the local communities. That's even through that experience in the summer. We need to have more capacities, more action plans, more warning systems, also in Germany, in our local communities, but worldwide, it is a strong topic. And we have to prepare. And we have to prepare our people that they know what to do in a crisis situation. So therefore, anticipation is one of the really crucial elements in humanitarian assistance. And I'm very glad that I've seen that UNDRR and OCHA have come up with a set of recommendations who are trying to implement in the whole humanitarian cycle anticipatory measures and talking about the integration into the system. I think that is very important. We have practical examples throughout the planet where it really makes a difference if people are informed and if there is a plan what to do, even if it's only a few days ahead of a natural crisis. We've seen that in the Philippines before typhoons were coming. It makes a difference if people can save their lives, maybe their livestock, and prepare for leaving for a certain time their area, their home, and then come back and build up again, or if they're losing anything, and are really in a poor humanitarian situation then at the end of the day. So I think we have a lot of evidence, and we had a lot of pilots already on that issue. So I think it's quite clear. We have examples from over 60 countries now. They're showing this difference I just was describing, from floods in Bangladesh to the question of extreme weather conditions in Mongolia, through various African countries, through Peru. We have evidence in all those countries about the value of anticipatory action. And I think it is a good sign. We just in Germany had this event, co-hosted an event together with UNOCHA and the UK. And I think it was a good sign that such a broad range of member states, UN member states, were part, and all were really trying to get the system working. As Martin Griffiths was saying, the humanitarian system must be as anticipatory as possible and only as reactive as necessary. I think that is quite a good quote, and that should be the guideline for the future actions we are taking. Our Foreign Minister Maarten in Germany earlier was mentioning that we are trying to double our contribution to anticipatory action in the next year, and to eventually, well, it's always, of course, due to the parliamentarians in the budget committee, but we are trying to contribute 100 million euro in 23. So you were talking about not only thinking in legislatory terms and of 4 or 5 years, but having a long-term run and a long-term access. And that's, I'm sure, what we are trying to do, and sure what is happening from our side. I can underline that. And yeah, we need data. I'm totally agreeing with Mami Mizutori. We need data, and we need data on the local ground. And I think that's one of the most important tasks the new UN Complex Risk Analytics Funds will have to provide us with, coming up with the data from the local ground and having this connection so we can be quicker and better informed and quicker in connection with the people on the ground who would otherwise suffer from extreme conditions. So all in all, data, capacity building, especially also on local ground. Of course, we need to finance that. Nothing is done without financing it. So we have to participate in that, and to have a long-term approach where we know we have to act now, but it's also for a long term in the future that we will have to act, and integrating anticipatory action in the whole system. Those would be the most important points from my point of view. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And again, a very clear set of priorities from a government that has already been a leader in this space. It's interesting indeed what you're highlighting about lessons learned even in Germany about some of these priorities, for instance, the importance of local action and local resilience, but also the challenges for the global system. And indeed, the need to think about a system. And it's good what you're highlighting about, for instance, OCHA and UNDRR getting together to put the pieces together and make sure that we're addressing all of these challenges at once, from the preparation for response and the anticipation for an earlier action and in some cases even earlier response, but all the way to the long-term agendas that Mami Mizutori was also talking about. I particularly value your emphasis on not just the need for data, but also the need for data that are relevant locally, because I think that's where it often where the challenges often come in, that the data are better in the richer countries, but also sometimes aggregated at too large a level to facilitate practical action by people most affected. And I think that brings me very naturally to our next panelist. Might I, by the way, also just highlight again that it's possible to ask questions in the chat to both the previous two speakers and the upcoming one. I'd also point you to the conference website for longer bios. I wanted to spend the time here in the panel actually listening to the speakers rather than reading out their long and impressive CVs, but for any background on them, please refer to the conference website. And with that, it's now a pleasure to turn to Dyce Nkhoma, the director of the Disaster Management Department in Malawi. Now, your country is, of course, affected by all of these challenges. You're facing droughts, you're facing floods. I had always thought of Malawi as a landlocked country, but I realized a few years ago that you're facing the impact of storms like Idai coming in Mozambique, but then of course also reaching you. So you are at the front lines of these rising risks and the challenges that we've been discussing here. You've been extremely active on the climate front. You know the importance of, as a very poor country as well, of the nexus of development and climate. On the one hand, ensuring your population is lifted out of poverty. On the other hand, coping with these recurrent shocks. I'd be very interested in hearing your government's perspective about whether we are coping and building resilience in the face of these rising risks, but also maybe more specifically where some of the weaknesses are in the system in addressing these challenges and what we can do better. In particular, if you have a chance to address how this is already reaching or not reaching the local level where action is most crucial, that will be much appreciated. Mr. Nkhoma.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the government of Germany for considering that Malawi can participate in this very important international conference on disaster risk reduction. This is really very important. Like my colleagues have put it, really, Malawi, like the other developing countries in Africa, they are really hard affected by the impact of climate change. We experience a lot of disasters that most of them, they are really beyond the capacity that we can actually handle at national level. Just to give an example, within the past 5 years or so, Malawi has experienced disasters that has caused a lot of damage, and the estimated cost of the damage that have been caused within that space of period, it's well in excess of 900 million US dollars, yeah, with close to $1 billion US dollars if we are to properly recover and reconstruct the damages that have been caused by the disasters. And as you have really well mentioned, most of those disasters are really weather related. We are talking of mostly floods and also drought. Those are the main disasters that we've been grappling. And really, as we have mentioned, we thought that by being an interlocked country, that we are not close to the sea, we thought we are cyclone proof, because we thought that those cyclones, they are like in the oceans, in the seas. But in 2019, really, we were affected very hard by the flood that were induced by the cyclone Idai that, of course, originated in the Mozambique Channel, but also it went over to Malawi, and it caused a lot of havoc, where we saw over 900,000 people being affected. And also we had over 80,000 people that were displaced, and we lost close to 60 people, with over 600 people being injured. And really, if we also look at the sporadic disaster that we always have, apart from those major ones, like from last year to this year in July, that's from July 2020 to June 2021. We've experienced those sporadic disasters, which are majorly also weather related, and those have affected over 37,000 households with different degrees, and also with some 67 people losing their lives, and over 200 people being injured. So just to give just an overview on how we are really affected. And all these disasters, we find that they are increasing because of the climate change. And beyond that, now the whole thing has been complicated with the coming in of COVID-19. Like any other developing country, really we've been hit hard. We know, if we talk about the absolute figures of people affected and then compare with our colleagues like you are in the European country, it might look that really maybe the figures in our colleagues' countries, they are higher than here. But when you look at the actual impact, economic impact, social impact, I think here it has really affected our countries much, much hard. We've seen the diversion of resources that would have been used for even addressing the disaster risks. Now they have been diverted to responding to the COVID-19. And even the little resources that would have been used for development, they have been diverted to responding to the challenges that have been brought by the COVID-19. So And even the effort that government have been making in addressing those disaster risks has been really greatly derailed, to show how really COVID-19 has affected. And now we are looking forward as to how we are going to respond to the current rainfall season, because our colleagues in the Department of Meteorological Services, they have indicated that this year we should expect normal to above normal rainfall. So when you talk about above normal rainfall, what it entails, it's floods. Now, the challenge that's going to be there, usually when you have floods, you have a lot of people that are displaced, which means they need to be put in camps. Now with the COVID-19, it's okay. Now when you cram people in the camps, what measures should we put in place to make sure that we are not creating super spreaders of COVID-19? And these people who are right in the villages. And as of now, when we look at the number of people that have been vaccinated, I think we have got impressive numbers in cities. In cities, people are getting the vaccine. But now when you go into the villages, is where it is a little difficult to really convince them to get the vaccine. So which means we are seeing people who are not vaccinated, and then we are bringing them at one place because of displacement due to flooding. So that's the issue that we are looking forward to. Say, okay, how really do we make sure that we are not posing a threat as a way as we think of addressing the issues that are going to be coming up quite soon. And with that, what I have mentioned really, it shows that there is urgent need that we should consider the humanitarian development nexus, because the impact of disasters or the emergencies that we are experiencing, now they have gone beyond short-term events. You find that in most areas it's chronic. It's almost an annual event. Every year you are considering about the same thing. So looking at that, it's now more or less like a prolonged response, a long-term intervention. So which is now affecting really the development. As you are addressing the current humanitarian need, you will discover that you are not really reaching out to addressing the root cause of those disasters. So right now, Malawi now, we are moving into that paradigm shift, trying to really link humanitarian work and development work. As a start, what we have done to address the chronic floods and droughts, which has ended up with chronic food shortage. In 2019, we developed what we call the National Resilience Strategy. So in that National Resilience Strategy, one of the aim is to strengthen the humanitarian development nexus. So that as we are doing the humanitarian, we should also incorporate issues of development. I know it's really not as easy to really transition from just humanitarian to the humanitarian development nexus. And also not just in that national resilience strategy where we are talking about the issues of humanitarian development nexus, but also in our overarching vision, the 2063 vision. One of the issues that government has identified is really to strengthen that humanitarian development nexus, how we can harness the two partners, the humanitarian partners and the development partners, how we can bring them together to synergize their efforts so that the two are going to be moving together. As I really mentioned that as we are transitioning, we see that it requires a little bit more effort because right now we are to see how we break the wall that is separating the two partners, the humanitarian partners and the development partners, so that we can bring them together and then see how the two interventions can be developed. So that is a challenge to really convince that the development partners to also consider the issues of humanitarian, because we are talking about addressing those root causes. Because in the humanitarian, because of the inadequate funding, what you do, you just address the current need, the current humanitarian need. And then you discover that it has now become a routine every year because we are just addressing the humanitarian need and then the root causes are still there. So every year we are just doing the same things, responding to the same challenges. So that I think this is not going to take us anywhere. It is just going to derail the development agenda of our country. So that's why we are trying to transition from just humanitarian to humanitarian development nexus. And another challenge that we are really experiencing in this area, it's the issue of coordination. Yeah, we have partners, some which are national partners and then international partners. So sometimes we have got even international partners who just come in and then they just go straight to the communities and then start implementing the interventions. So that has ended up kind of like derailing the priority of government, because what they will be implementing sometimes is not what the government would have loved to be implemented. And also because government doesn't know the other partners who are working down there, it is becoming a little bit difficult to regulate. You find that maybe in one district council, you have several partners that are working there, and sometimes implementing similar activities. And then you have other districts where you do not have partners that can assist communities in that district. So really that poses a challenge. And sometimes not just international partners, but even some local non-governmental organizations, right? So we have really that challenge. Another challenge is the normal one, the usual one, which we cannot even mention, the inadequate resources, inadequate funding. Yeah, that one is always there. As much as we would like to really go for full effort in this humanitarian development nexus, but now the funding is not really adequate, then you are forced just to consider the immediate humanitarian needs. That's both even to the government side. You discover that I think due to inadequate resources, they will provide resources which will just go to the humanitarian response. That's really a challenge. So quickly, let me also just talk on how this really goes down to the grassroots, because really it is the grassroots where the impact is actually felt. We have really some challenges. The first challenge is really to make the grassroots see the connection between dealing with the disaster risks and then the impact of climate change. Yeah, so when you go down there, the grassroots, these two things, they take them separately as a phenomenon that do not influence each other. So because of that, really, it is becoming difficult to see how the DRR sector can work in close collaboration with the climate change sector. However, at national level, we have started tackling that. Initially, we have two different committees that are looking into these two. We have a committee on disaster risk management, and then we have a steering committee on climate change. So when we saw this challenge, we initiated that these two committees, they should be meeting together. They should be having joint meetings and joint planning meetings, so that we plan together, because we talk about climate change. Really, it is the major cause of the risks that we are experiencing now. So we have seen the fruits of these joint meetings. At least things are improving. What it requires now is to take down to the communities this integration. That's what we are doing. And on the risk reduction, as I mentioned, the priority even from the from government, you find that the resources that we get from government to address the issues of risk reduction, they are really not adequate. We know that government is really prioritizing, to deal with the risk reduction, but now because of the frequency of disaster that we are experiencing, then government is forced to just use the available resources just for humanitarian needs. So it means this part of risk reduction, really, it is suffering the little funding. Yeah. So really, as I finish, let me say that I think as a developing country, like any other developing countries, we really need close cooperation with our international partners. Yeah, not just on the financing, but even on the technical part, we need that close collaboration. I really agree with the theme of this year's International Day for Disaster Reduction. Okay, stepping up the international cooperation so that we can deal with the ever-increasing disaster risks. Where we are going, really, just the national effort, they are proving not to be adequate. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that elaborate explanation, also highlighting the challenges, coping with the current realities while trying to look ahead, challenges of resourcing, but also challenges of coordination. And thank you for sharing some examples. These two committees, I think, a powerful example of how things are often working in parallel. You bringing it together, I think, is the sort of integration that we need more broadly. But also the challenge is bringing that down to the local level. And indeed, also sometimes the challenge is many actors coming in, trying to do the right thing, but not always being coordinated. May I address one of the questions that was posed, in this case by Daniel Lawrence of the Free University of Berlin, who is asking, what are the current weak links between disaster risk reduction in a humanitarian context and disaster risk reduction in a development context? Are we actually making those links, and what can be done to strengthen that? Maybe also from the perspective of the international institutions supporting that, Ms. Mizutori, or the donor agencies trying to advance this work. So if I may come to the other two panelists, maybe also reflecting a little bit on the Malawi examples we just heard. Thank you.
So if I may, Maarten, I think there was a time when you had humanitarian response to a certain crisis, and then it would be smoothly or almost smoothly taking into development. Now we are not living in a world as such. There are many protracted humanitarian crises, and as we have been discussing from the beginning, the issues are multiple and compounded. So one link that we need to strengthen is to really embed risk-informed activities from the beginning of any kind of humanitarian response, so that the humanitarian response itself It's not creating any new risks. That's very important. And also the fact that risk is almost everywhere. We live in a multi-hazard world. There are natural disasters, natural hazards, there are man-made hazards, and there are also a lot of countries, especially in the most least developed countries, issues of conflict and whatnot, fragility. So these all need to be addressed at the same time and not in silos. As Mr. Nkhoma was mentioning, even something that you would think that are so close, right? Disaster risk reduction in climate management. In many countries, even in developed countries, they are addressed separately. And that is where we lose the risk lens. That is where we lose the needed capacity, energy, and funding. So really, that's important. And I really was very impressed listening to Mr. Nkhoma, because Mr. Nkhoma was telling us how other issues that we are portraying here at the global level really can they be solved, or can they be challenges at the ground level? So what was mentioned about the impact of disaster being so harsh, hence we need to do more climate adaptation. Exactly, but that's not enough, because as Mr. Nkhoma was saying, we need to address the root causes of the disaster, and that is exactly disaster risk reduction. The coordination between partners is something that we need to do not only at the local level, but at all levels, sometimes with all our generosity and with all our goodwill. We do not have enough coordination among the donor community, among the within the UN system, and that has to change. And finally, I would say that yes, we need more enhanced international cooperation. So from this COP26, there are many important agenda, but one of them is adaptation and resilience, right? And we need to really scale up the ambition and financing for adaptation so that the pledged $100 billion will be committed and implemented, but the share would be 50-50 mitigation adaptation, because unfortunately the impact is getting so harsh. Over to you, Maarten.
Thank you so much. And you're already hinting at what will be the last segment of our conversation here, the expectations of Glasgow. But maybe first I'll give Ms. Kofler a chance also to respond to that previous question of how the humanitarian focus on disaster risk reduction and the development focus on disaster risk reduction need to be linked together. What's working, where do we have steps to make, also from a donor perspective?
Thank you very much. Ms. Mizutori was mentioning already a lot of very important points. I don't want to double them, but I think what is also interesting is to know where you historically come from, because humanitarian approach and assistance always is the support of those who were suffering from some crisis catastrophes. It's the respond on that. Development work has to do something with two partner countries debating how we can go together some path in the future to develop a region, a country, or area. So you need a political agreement on that. So you see already there's something coming together which might be difficult. So if we go more into anticipatory issues, I think this may be contradiction in between a humanitarian approach and humanitarian principles and political commitments you need for development work. We can somehow solve this contradictions, because it's oriented on the needs and oriented on the root causes, like Mr. Nkhoma was saying, how to really milder or work against the root causes of upcoming crises. And that's something I think we can more easily agree. Then, of course, the coordination is a big issue. You were mentioning the difficulties, for example, in between pandemic crisis and at the same time national catastrophes, some maybe local crisis in local conflicts or whatever. So if you have different approaches from those different angles who are then leading to a humanitarian crisis, it needs a lot of really coordination, because there are so many different actors, donors, countries, non-governmental organizations, UN organizations on the ground, and it has to be coordinated somehow, and that is very challenging. So that makes it a challenge, the nexus a challenge, but we're trying to work on that, and just want to end with that. We're trying to work on that. We have now in Germany, through our Foreign Affairs Ministry and our Ministry of Development and Cooperation, International Cooperation, a really new approach and link to cooperate in between our donor structure and have the nexus included. We call it chapeau concept. That's like the French hat, you know, chapeau. So we try to bring that all under one hat. Let's put it maybe that way. And we are also trying to do that with our financing structures. So on the one thing, had you have, for example, the UN serve the funding for unexpected crisis, let's put it that way. And on the other hand, you have, for example, NGOs where we have to really get better, so to get the different levels together, from the UN level to the grassroots level. So what we are doing is, for example, financing NGO network START, who having this system of anticipatory alert, where you get to know what is happening on the ground from a rotating committee of experts. And then with that, you can finance things who are needed on the ground. And to get all those things together, it makes clear that it is challenging and not something you just do by having a good will. It starts with the will, but we still have practical steps to go. But I'm optimistic that we are on our way, and with everything what Mr. Nkhoma also was explaining, what, for example, Malawi is doing with its own plans on becoming more resilient and becoming better. If we cooperate closely and work together closely, I'm sure we can come to good solutions.
Thank you very much. And I would indeed say we're making progress, but also in the face of a giant challenge. And your support, for instance, to the Anticipation Hub, where all these actors, the UN agencies, the local NGOs, the actors from countries like Malawi are meeting, exchanging knowledge, but also figuring out very practically in individual programming how we sort this out. I think those sorts of interfaces are much appreciated. And again, thank you for your leadership from the German government side on that agenda. We're running out of time. I have many very interesting questions. So I trust the rest of the DRR conference will be excellent and you'll be able to address all of this. Several questions about data. Also a question from Jörg Wilbring in the I4C office in Southern Africa about what humanitarians can do to generate the political will to address some of these issues. Also several questions about how we can better, for instance, from Holger Flöting in Germany, how we can better strengthen the role of local municipalities rather than just having these national frameworks. So coming back a bit to the Malawi question, but maybe I'll just hint at these different questions and leave it up to the panelists if they want to say anything about that in the context of what will be my question for you now. Glasgow is starting on Sunday. World leaders, well, I guess in the case of the UN, you'll have the world leader representing you, but in the case of Germany and Malawi, I trust it will be your head of state representing you there. We're all looking at them to now address this giant crisis that is already underway. We heard that very clearly from Malawi, but might get further out of hand over the coming decades. Particularly for the topics we discussed today, what are your expectations and what would be your call on all of us, but maybe also a little bit on humanitarians in terms of spurring us all to action in that conference starting on Sunday. Ms. Mizutori, may I start with you?
Thank you very much, Maarten. So as I did already mention, but I'm going to repeat it because it's very important. This COP focuses on many things, but one important thing is about adaptation and resilience. And the Secretary General has been mentioning this repeatedly, that we need to raise our ambition towards climate adaptation and enhance financing for climate adaptation. This has been a strong call from the developing countries as well, and a 50-50 share between mitigation and adaptation of the financing. This needs to come out from the COP. The second thing I would say is that we hope that disaster risk reduction actions will also be scaled up. Because, as Mr. Nkhoma was mentioning, unless we do this, we will not stop preventing new risks. We will not be able to address the root causes of risk. And actually, these risks, new risks, are fueled by climate change, combined with other drivers of risk, including environmental degradation, inequality, uncontrolled urbanization. It's a very long list. And we do need to look at disaster risk reduction, because what that does is address the drivers of risk. And in terms of humanitarian, I think that what we're talking today about anticipatory action is really gaining force. Germany is one of the countries that started this many years ago. And now I think it has become a core way of doing a humanitarian action and looking at the long-term development. So I do hope that this will also be a main thread at the discussion at COP. Over to you, Maarten.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kofler.
Well, to spare time, I could say Mrs. Mizutori said everything. But of course, I want to underline that it's really important. I was mentioning before, it's of course about mitigation. And that has to do with what Mr. Nkhoma was mentioning, the root causes of a lot of problems we are having their cause in climate change. And of course, reduction of carbon dioxide and various natural gases who are causing climate change is a key issue. That's true. But on the other hand, we see already all over the world that problems are already rising. So adaptation is important. And in that case also, of course, like Ms. Mizutori was mentioning, we have to have a close look and not only adapting after something happened, but what could be done in advance, and do it on all levels we can get, from the UN levels to the national levels or the regional levels, and especially also to the ground and to the local levels. And I think that is also where, because I think that was one of the questions, where the experience of so many humanitarian workers could come in. They have to make a difference also in their political in their political views or in their experience they are sharing with us for the COP, because it is important to know from their side what could be done quite practically on the ground to really help people not to suffer so much from crisis like they did in the past. And well, to get this experience also on board, I think is one thing I really would expect from the COP, and what I would hope for, that that is part of the outcome. And finally, I just want to say, because we are in a transitional time in Germany and we will come up with a new government, but I think you all can expect the new government at least as committed to the topics, especially also to the topic of disaster risk reduction, as the old government was. So it's we're trying to stand for continuous work and hopefully working with all of you together again.
Thank you. This journey isn't over for sure, so we count on you as a continued partner. Thank you. Mr. Nkhoma. And I'm told we have to head back to the studio soon, so if you could keep it brief. I'm sorry, we're coming to you last.
All right, no problem. That's okay. See, my colleagues, I think they have put it well. But I think from my side, as one of the developing countries, let me just stress the point that I made, that we really require strong cooperation, international cooperation. Of course, not just the funding. We really need the funding for disaster risk reduction. But beyond that, we need that cooperation, that collaboration. You know, sometimes like you have this international NGO, for example, it is in Germany, and then they have the funding. They design the project right there. And then when they come here with already designed project, designed in Germany, implemented in a village in Malawi. You can see the challenges that are going to be there. So what I should stress is that the collaboration, cooperation between the local governments and then the international partners, so that we can deal with the ever increasing risks due to the climate change. Thank you very much. I shouldn't take much time.
Thank you so much. And what a wisdom there to take to Glasgow, but also to take to all these places where we're doing our daily work. So I hear calls for ambition addressing the root causes of this crisis, which include indeed those emissions, but also the poverty and the inequalities we have in the world. I hear calls to step up, bringing all our experience on disaster risk reduction and better humanitarian work, including anticipation, to the table and scaling up, also in the financing. But then finally, also not just thinking about quantity of financing, but also quality of financing, making sure we hear those local voices of people already affected, but often also holding the keys to the most effective action and working in partnership, for instance, with governments like Malawi's, which has already shown that leadership, getting their coordination right, with leading donors like Germany, and then of course with the UN system, working with everyone and keeping it all coordinated. I want to thank these three panelists for their wonderful remarks. Wish us all luck in Glasgow, but certainly well beyond, because this is a journey that won't end soon. But thank you all for your leadership, and back to the studio.
Ja, thank you, Maarten, and thank you to the panelists. Das war ein wirklich spannender Auftakt für unsere Tagung und bei uns geht es jetzt direkt in die Workshop-Sessions. Dazu noch ein paar kleine Hinweise. Ihr findet die Workshops parallel auf den Zeitschienen unterhalb der Studiozeitleiste und könnt euch da einfach in den Workshop reinklicken, an dem ihr am liebsten teilnehmen wollt. Es wird diesmal 5 parallele Sessions geben, 3 im Livestreaming und 2 über eine Verlinkung in Zoom-Räumen. Da gibt es ein paar kleine Unterschiede. Die Workshops, die im Streaming laufen, finden hier ganz normal im Fenster auf unserer Seite statt. Der Workshop wird aufgezeichnet und der Kontakt zu den Referierenden kann nur über den Chat im roten Bereich stattfinden. Und ihr kennt das übrigens an dem kleinen Streaming-Icon, welche Workshops im Streaming laufen. Und die Workshops, die im Zoom stattfinden, wenn ihr euch da reinklickt, werdet ihr weitergeleitet in diesen externen Zoom-Raum. Ihr könnt ganz normal über die Zoom-Option, also über Audio, Video und natürlich den Zoom-Chat mit den Referierenden in den Austausch gehen. Und diese Workshops werden nicht aufgezeichnet. Ich wünsche euch ganz viel Spaß in den Workshops und wir treffen uns um 13 Uhr pünktlich wieder hier im Hauptstream.